Hi, 6th grade students. Today we're going to be doing a little bit of review of what we did in the last video about adding integers, and then today we're going to deal with how do we add much larger integers than we were dealing with last time. So if you'll flip back a page and if you'll remember the things that you wrote down from your last set of notes, we added integers with models, right? Which means that we drew these chips, what we called them, or circle models, where we represented the numbers that we were given, either positive or negative, and then we were able to find our answer by either adding them up and combining them up, or by marking out negatives and positives, which we talked about equaled 0, right? And so hopefully now that you've practiced this some, you're starting to see some patterns about what we would have learned, about how we can maybe generalize this or how we could come up with rules to make it much faster. So I'm hoping that what you've seen, hopefully you're getting tired of modeling or drawing out some of these number lines and picture models, because hopefully you've noticed, and I'm looking at the first 3 examples here. Hopefully you've noticed from these first 3 examples that if you add 2 positive numbers together, that's just like normal, right? We just add like we've been adding since we were in 1st grade. There is no difference between adding 2 negative numbers. The only difference between adding 2 positives and 2 negatives is that we're still adding the numbers. The answer is just going to be negative, right? So we know that 2 plus 5 is 7, because 2 and 5 more make 7. And then we know that 2 negatives plus 5 more negatives is also 7, but it's negative, right? And so we found here in example 3 that really what we could have just done, instead of drawing these models, what we could have done is we could have just added 3 and 2 together, and then because they're both negative, kept the negative sign, right? Now this is going to come in very helpful in the next set of notes that we're going to take, because we're going to be dealing with adding, like, what if these numbers were much bigger? So what if we were dealing with like negative 100 and negative 75? Well, we don't want to have to draw out 100 of these little chips, right? Nor do we want to have to draw out 75 negatives. But if we know that 100 plus 75 is 175, and they're both negative, then we know that our answer will be negative 175. So we're going to do that first, and we'll come back to the positives and negatives here in just a second. But if you will flip back over to your next page here, we're going to call this adding integers. And of course, our last title page was with models. This is going to be without models. So no drawing pictures this time around. We're just going to have some rules. All right. So when we're doing this, rule number 1, there's going to be 2 rules actually. Rule number 1. And this rule is for adding a negative. I'm going to write this in all caps. Adding negative plus negative. So 2 negative numbers, adding a negative number plus another negative number. And here's what that rule says, or here's what we're going to do in this rule. So step number 1, we are going to add the numbers. Just like normal. No big deal. Just add the numbers. 2 negatives, add the numbers together. And then number 2, we are going to keep the negative sign. Right, and that's exactly what happened over here on this last page, examples 1 through 3, right? We just added the numbers together, kept the negative sign. Added 3 plus 2, got 5, kept the negative sign. Now, that's going to be different when we go down here to positive and negative, but in general, if you're adding 2 negative numbers, we're just going to add the numbers, keep the negative sign. So, for example, and of course I told you the reason we want to do this is because we're dealing with bigger numbers this time. So what if I have the problem negative 14 plus negative 12, right? Negative 14 plus negative 12. Well, the first thing I want to do, I recognize that it's 2 negatives. I'm adding 2 negatives numbers together. That's important. First thing I'm going to do is add the numbers. So I want to do 14 plus 12. Now you cannot use a calculator on this, so you are going to have to do some little old school addition off to the side if you don't know what 14 plus 12 is. And so when we add that, right, we're going to add this column. 4 plus 2 is 6. and we don't have anything to carry, so 1 plus 1 is 2, so the answer is 26. But now they're both negative, so that second step, remember, is to keep the negative sign. So negative 14 plus negative 12 is equal to negative 26. That's what we got when we added them. Keep the negative sign, all right? All right, so I'm going to give you one to try on your own. Maybe you pause the video while you're doing this. Example number 2, let's do negative 62 plus negative 59. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can add those numbers up and see what you get. All right, I hope you took the time to pause the video and try this yourself. So again, I noticed that they're both negative. So I'm just going to go off here to the side. I'm going to add these two numbers together. 9 plus 2 is 9, 10, 11. I'm going to have to carry the 1 over to my tens column. Don't forget how to add. That would be bad. And then 1 plus 6 is 7. And 7 plus 5 more is 12. And so the answer is 121. But now, is it positive or negative? And so, again, remember, we're adding the numbers, but we keep the negative sign. So my final answer here is actually negative 121. Probably should have left myself more space there. Final answer of negative 62 plus negative 59 is negative 121. Now, again, that is probably the easiest of them, and this rule only works when you're adding negatives plus negatives, right? Now, what's going to happen when we add a negative and a positive number? Well, that's going to result in rule number 2. And so rule number 2, we're going to talk about what happens when we're adding negative plus a positive. Negative plus positive. Or for that matter, a positive plus a negative, right? It doesn't matter which one's going to come first. Or a positive plus a negative. T-I, that's a T. It should be a T right there, not an I. All right, so negatives and positive, or positives and negatives. Again, we're just adding one of each, right? Either we're adding a negative number plus a positive, or a positive plus a negative. And so the rules are going to be a little differently. And let's look back at our previous page. Let's look at examples 4 through 6, or 4 through 7, I'm sorry. Because, again, that is where we were actually adding negative and positive numbers together. So, for example 4, we had 2 plus negative 5, and we ended up with negative 3. We had 6 plus negative 4. We ended up with 2, positive 2. We had 4 plus negative 3. We ended up with negative 3. And then we had negative 6 plus 3, and we ended up with negative 3 as well. Now, take a second. Think about those numbers and how they are related to each other. And see if you can think up a rule for how we could add either, like I said, a positive plus a negative, or, like example 7, a negative plus a positive. I'll give you a second to think about that. Well, how are 2 and 5 related to 3? What can I do with the numbers 2 and 5 to get 3? Well, if you think about subtraction, 5 minus 2 is actually 3, right? Now, we'll talk about the signs in a minute, but let's see if that works for all of these. What is, again, I'm taking the bigger number, so in this case it was 5 minus 2. In this case, I'm going to do 6 minus 4. Well, that's 2. 7 minus 4 is 3, and 6 minus 3 is also 3. So one of the things that happens when you add a positive number and a negative number together is, in reality, what you are actually doing is subtraction. Now, think of the number line. I think really helps us think about that, because remember when you were doing these models on the number line, if you went in the positive direction and then back in the negative direction, or if you went in the negative direction and then in the positive direction, you were always going opposite. You went one way and then you went backwards, or you went one way and you went backwards, which is equivalent to subtracting. When you go backwards or taking something away, even when you went to negative 6, you took away some negatives by backing up, right, in the positive direction. And so one way we can think of adding positive and negative numbers is really subtraction. Now, the key is knowing what sign to put, because if 5 minus 2 is actually 3, if I'm really subtracting these numbers, why is it negative 3 and not positive 3? Well, even if you think about the chips or even the number line, But the chips, which number did we have more of in the beginning? Did we have more positives or more negatives? We had more negatives, and so my final answer becomes negative. Here, which one did I have more of? I had more positives. 6 is a positive number. There's more of those than there are negatives. And my answer was positive. And so if you look down through here, it's the number that you're going to have more of. In this case, -5, +6, -7 results in a negative answer. -6 results in a negative answer. The reason this is my only positive answer is because this is the only one where I had more positive numbers than I did negatives. And so the rules for adding positives and negatives together are as follows. Step 1, we are actually going to subtract the numbers. Subtract the numbers. So instead of adding, even though this is an addition problem, the very fact that one's a negative and one's a positive means we're going in the opposite direction, so it actually results in subtraction. All right, so that's going to be weird to remember. When you're adding, you actually subtract, which is why it's going to be very important that we pay attention to our signs. All right, then step 2, remember step 2 up here was to keep the negative sign. Well, this is not always going to result in a negative number. Sometimes it'll be negative, sometimes it'll be positive. And how will we know? We're going to keep the sign of the number which has more. We're just going to ask ourselves, which one of these numbers had more? Did we have more negatives or did we have more positives? And we're going to use that sign. All right, so let's try one. So example number 3. Let's say we have the problem, we'll start relatively nice. Let's say we have the problem -13 + 6. And again, I could draw out 13 negatives and 6 positives and mark out the positives and negatives, but I'm trying to do this without having to model. And so I'm going to use my steps. Step 1 is to subtract the numbers. So I'm going to go off here to the side and I'm going to subtract them this time instead of adding them. So 13 minus 6. Now if we notice, if you're doing this by columns, you cannot take 3 and subtract 6 away. So I'm going to have to borrow from my 1, which makes that a 0, which makes this a 13, which really is what I was doing in the first place. 13, and then take away 6, ends up being 7. You could count that up. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And then once I have subtracted the numbers, I know that my answer is going to be 7, but is it going to be +7 or -7? That's where I have to keep the sign of the number which has more. Well, which one, if I were drawing the model, would I have more negatives or more positives? Well, 13 is a bigger number. Now, -13 is less than 6, yes, but I would have more negatives than I would have positives. And so the one that has more is negative, and so I stick my negative symbol there. So the answer to -13 + 6 is -7. All right, let's try another one. We're actually going to try 2 more. We'll do 5 examples. So example number 4, let's try -38 + 94. All right, and what is that going to equal? So again, it's going to be important here that you recognize they're different signs. I have a negative and a positive number that I'm adding together. And so instead of just adding them together, because what some of you are going to do when you start practicing is you're going to add together 38 and 94 and keep it positive. And you're going to be like, what happened? Well, no, this is a negative and a positive. So my first step, instead of adding, is to subtract them. Now, I'm going to put the one that has more on top. You cannot do 38 take away 94, but I can do 94 take away 38. So just like up here, oops, I guess it would help if I wrote an 8. Just like up here we did 13 minus 6, we're going to put the one that has more on top. And that will actually help you go ahead and decide what sign you're going to be, because you already have to think about, is 94 have more or 38 have more? Well, 94 has more. All right, so we're going to subtract. Again, we're going to have to borrow because you cannot do 4 minus 8. So borrow, that's going to make that a 14, and that changes my 9 to 8. 14 take away 8 is 6. And then 8 minus 3 is 5. So my answer is 56. Now, is it positive or negative? And so I look back and I say, okay, which one has more? Well, I have more positives here. -38 is, I would have to draw out 94 positives and 38 negatives. I would have more positives, so my answer is going to remain positive. So the answer to -38 and 94 is 56. And I've told you all before, and I think I mentioned it in the last video, sometimes it's helpful to think about all of this in terms of money, right? Because if you're $13 in debt and you find $6, you are less in debt than you were, right? Now you're only $7 in debt. Well, same thing here. If you're in debt to somebody $38 and then you find $94, well, you can pay off your debt and now you've actually got some money left over, right? You have $56. All right, I'm going to give you one of these to work out. This is a negative and a positive number together. And so once I write it down, if you'll stop the video, try it out, and then we'll check the answer together. So this problem is going to be 62 plus negative 27. So it might be helpful to go ahead and pause the video, try that out, and then we'll check your answer. All right, I hope that you paused the video, and we're going to go ahead and work this out. So again, we notice that it's a positive and a negative. We're going to subtract the numbers. I'm going to put the one that has more on top. Which one has more, 62 or 27? 62 is going to go on top because it has more, and I'm going to subtract these numbers. You won't always have to borrow, but all of these problems we've had to. I'm going to have to borrow and get 12, and the 6 is going to mark out, and that's going to get that a 5. 7 or 12, take away 7. That's 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That gives me 5. And then 5 minus 2 is 3. So my answer is 35. Is it going to be positive or negative? I'm going to write down my 35. You look back and you ask yourself which one had more? More positives than negatives. So my answer is going to be positive 35. So your practice for the majority of this week is going to be to practice using the rule to add integers, negative and positive numbers together, much larger numbers. You should not have to model, but you're either going to use rule 1, adding negative and negative, or rule 2, adding a negative and a positive in order to complete these problems. Send me an email if you have any questions.